Have you ever watched a slice of cheese slowly melt over a hot burger or stretch perfectly from a slice of pizza, turning soft, glossy, and irresistible, yet somehow not immediately burning even when it's sitting right over heat? It feels almost like cheese has its own built-in timing, melting first before anything else happens. But that smooth transformation isn't magic. It's science quietly at work in your kitchen. And once you understand what's going on, you'll never look at melted cheese the same way again. Today we will uncover the hidden science behind why cheese melts so beautifully before it ever burns, right here on History of Simple Things. To understand why cheese melts before it burns, we need to look at what cheese is actually made of. At its core, cheese is a complex structure made up of water, fat, and proteins, mainly a group called casein proteins. These components are tightly packed together in a network that gives cheese its solid form when it's cool. Think of it like a sponge made of microscopic strands holding fat and water in place. When heat is applied, the first thing that happens is not burning, it's softening. The fat inside the cheese begins to melt at relatively low temperatures, usually around 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. As this fat liquefies, it loosens the structure of the cheese, making it softer and more flexible. At the same time, the protein network begins to relax, allowing everything to flow more freely. This is what creates that smooth, gooey melt we all recognize. But here's the key detail. Melting and burning are two completely different processes. Melting is a physical change. It's just a shift in form from solid to liquid. Burning, on the other hand, is a chemical reaction that happens at much higher temperatures. For cheese to burn, its proteins and sugars need to break down and react with heat in a process known as the Maillard reaction. This reaction is what gives browned food its deep flavors and golden color. It's the same reason toast turns brown or meat develops a crust when seared. But the Maillard reaction doesn't happen right away. It typically starts at temperatures above 140 to 165 degrees Celsius, which is far hotter than the temperature needed to melt cheese. So when you place cheese over heat, it enters a kind of safe zone first. The temperature rises enough to melt the fat and soften the proteins, but not yet high enough to trigger burning. That's why cheese can sit there bubbling and stretching before it ever starts to brown. Another important factor is water content. Most cheeses contain a surprising amount of water, especially softer varieties like mozzarella. Water plays a big role in slowing down the burning process. As the cheese heats up, the water inside begins to evaporate, and this evaporation absorbs heat energy. In simple terms, it acts like a cooling system, preventing the temperature of the cheese from rising too quickly. This is why moist cheeses tend to melt more smoothly and resist burning longer, while drier cheeses can brown faster. If you've ever baked something with shredded cheddar on top, you might notice it starts to crisp and brown more quickly than mozzarella. That's because it has less water to buffer the heat. Fat also plays a protective role. As it melts, it coats the proteins and slows down how quickly they heat up and react. This layer of melted fat helps distribute heat more evenly across the cheese, reducing the chances of sudden burning in one spot. It's almost like a built-in heat shield. But not all cheeses behave the same way when heated. Some melt beautifully, while others barely soften at all. This comes down to how tightly their protein networks are structured. Cheeses like mozzarella, fontina, and Gouda have a more flexible protein arrangement, which allows them to stretch and flow when heated. On the other hand, cheeses like feta or paneer have a more rigid structure that holds its shape even under heat. Aged cheeses also behave differently. As cheese ages, it loses moisture and its proteins become more tightly bonded. This makes it less likely to melt smoothly and more likely to break apart or brown quickly. That's why a young cheese melts into a creamy pool, while an older cheese might turn oily or crumbly when heated. Now let's talk about what happens when cheese finally does start to burn. Once most of the water has evaporated and the temperature continues to rise, the conditions become right for chemical reactions. The proteins and any remaining sugars begin to react through the Maillard reaction, creating new compounds that produce browning and complex flavors. At this stage, you'll start to see golden spots forming on the cheese. This is actually desirable in many dishes. Think of the perfectly brown top of a baked lasagna or a pizza fresh out of the oven. But if the heat keeps increasing, those same reactions can go too far, leading to bitterness and eventually burning. So, in a way, melting is just the first chapter, and browning is the next. Cheese transitions gradually from softening to melting to browning, and only then to burning. Each stage depends on temperature, moisture, and time. Even the way cheese is cut or shredded can make a difference. Smaller pieces melt faster because they have more surface area exposed to heat. This can also mean they reach browning temperatures more quickly if the heat is too high. A thick slice, on the other hand, takes longer to heat through, giving it more time to melt before any burning begins. All of this explains why cheese feels so forgiving when cooking. You have a window of time where it melts perfectly before things start to go wrong. That window exists because melting happens at a much lower temperature than burning, and because cheese contains natural elements like water and fat that slow down the heating process. But once you understand that balance, you can also control it. Lower heat gives you more time for smooth melting. Higher heat pushes things toward browning and crisping. And if you go too far, burning is the final step waiting at the end. So the next time you watch cheese melt over your food, remember that you're seeing a carefully timed sequence of physical and chemical changes. The fat is softening, the proteins are loosening, the water is evaporating, and the temperature is slowly climbing toward the point where deeper reactions begin. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.